13 men were dead by the time the last shot echoed through the trees, their bodies scattered along a narrow Appalachian ridgeline that locals had always considered quiet, forgettable, safe. By sunrise, police would struggle to explain how a dispute over a single hunting dog had escalated into the deadliest clan-related killing the region had seen in decades. But the truth was far less sudden than it appeared. To understand what happened in the fall of 1989, you have to rewind months earlier, to a stretch of land straddling the West Virginia-Kentucky border, where isolation shaped people as much as bloodlines did. The Lawson family had lived there for generations, bound not only by name, but by land, loyalty, and an unspoken rule. What happened in the hills stayed in the hills. Earl Lawson, the eldest surviving brother, was known as a hard man even by Appalachian standards. Quiet in public, absolute in private. The kind of person neighbors avoided contradicting. His younger brothers, Caleb, Mason, and Roy, followed his lead without question. Hunting wasn't recreation for them. It was ritual, tradition, and identity. The dog at the center of this story, a brindle-plotted hound named Redbone, was trained from a pup to track deer through terrain most men wouldn't cross in daylight. When Redbone disappeared after a late October hunt, suspicion settled immediately on a neighboring group of men who camped near Lawson land every season. No one reported the dog missing. No sheriff was called. Instead, Earl Lawson began asking questions the way he always had, quietly at first, then with pressure. Over the following weeks, witnesses would later recall tense encounters at gas stations, murmured confrontations outside diners, and a growing sense that something had been set in motion that could not be stopped. This was not a story about tempers flaring in a moment. It was about grievances allowed to ferment. Each unanswered question hardened into certainty. Each rumor became proof. By early November, the Lawsons were convinced Redbone had been taken, not lost, and that taking from them was an unforgivable act. Around this point, roughly 10 minutes into what would later be reconstructed by investigators, many viewers ask why no one stepped in, why no one de-escalated, why these men didn't simply walk away. If you're finding this story unsettling already, it only grows more controlled, more deliberate from here. Because once the Lawsons decided they had been wronged, the outcome was no longer a matter of if, but when. And what happened next unfolded over a single night in the mountains, where darkness, pride, and proximity turned a trivial loss into irreversible consequence. By mid-November, the Appalachian hills had already slipped into their colder rhythm, the kind of damp chill that settled into bones and kept people indoors after dark. That isolation worked in the Lawsons' favor. Earl Lawson began mapping routines without ever writing anything down. Who drove which truck, which men hunted together, who drank at Miller's Tavern on Fridays, who camped overnight instead of returning to town. The group he fixated on consisted of 13 men, loosely connected by seasonal hunting trips and shared land access. Not a clan, not a gang. Just men who trusted familiarity more than caution. Among them was Thomas Grady, a soft-spoken mechanic from Pike County who had borrowed dogs before and returned them without issue. Walter Hensley, who owned the cabin nearest Lawson property. And a pair of cousins, Ben and Curtis Rowe, known for staying late in the woods to drink and tell stories after hunts. None of them knew Redbone's name, and none of them knew they were being watched. Over several weeks, Lawson family members appeared in places they normally didn't. Parked along dirt access roads, sitting in trucks outside taverns without going in, asking indirect questions that sounded casual but weren't. "You seen a brindle hound lately?" Mason Lawson asked one man at a fuel pump, his tone flat, eyes never leaving the other's face. The answer didn't matter. The reaction did. Each denial was interpreted as deception, Each shrug was taken as disrespect. What made the situation dangerous was not anger, but certainty. By the time December approached, the Lawsons were no longer seeking confirmation. They were assembling justification. On December 3, 1989, a date that would later appear repeatedly in court transcripts, Earl gathered his brothers at the old family shed just before dusk. No shouting, no dramatic speeches. He spoke in short sentences, outlining where each man would be that night and why. This wasn't framed as revenge. It was framed as correction. Somewhere around this point, about 10 minutes into a documentary retelling, viewers often feel the tension settle into something heavier, a sense that the story has passed a threshold. If you're still watching at this stage, it's because you understand that this is no longer about a dog. And if this kind of slow-building, evidence-driven storytelling matters to you, this is the moment creators usually ask viewers to subscribe, not for sensationalism, but because cases like this, forgotten and poorly documented, only stay visible if people choose to keep following them. That night, as trucks rolled out one by one onto unlit roads, none of the 13 men knew their movements had already been accounted for, and none of the Lawsons believed there was any other way this could end. The night of December 3rd settled over the mountains without wind, the kind of stillness that made distant sounds travel farther than they should. One by one, the 13 men converged on Hensley's cabin, unaware that the gathering itself was the final variable Earl Lawson had been waiting for. To them, it was routine. A late hunt, a shared meal, drinks after dark. To the Lawsons, it was alignment. Earl positioned himself along an old logging trail overlooking the clearing, while Caleb and Roy took lower ground near the access road, their trucks parked nose out for a fast exit. Mason moved closest to the cabin, close enough to hear laughter through the walls. There was no countdown, no signal beyond timing. When the first man stepped outside to relieve himself, Mason later told investigators he felt a sense of relief. Not excitement, not rage, but relief that the moment had finally arrived. The first shots came from the ridge, controlled and spaced, not panicked. Inside the cabin, confusion replaced conversation almost instantly. Chairs scraped. Someone shouted a name. Another voice asked if it was a joke. By the time the men inside realized the gunfire wasn't accidental, exits were already covered. Those who ran toward the trees were cut off by angles they couldn't see in the dark. Those who stayed inside were trapped by walls that offered no protection. Survivors would later recall how quickly sound disappeared after each shot, how the woods seemed to absorb everything. The Lawsons moved methodically, not advancing, not retreating, simply firing until movement stopped. There were moments of hesitation, one man raising his hands, another calling out that there had been a mistake. But the Lawsons interpreted every word as further proof of guilt. This was not chaos. It was execution without ceremony. When it ended, 13 men lay dead across the clearing, the cabin, and the surrounding brush, their bodies positioned exactly where circumstance had placed them. The Lawsons didn't linger. They didn't check pulses. They didn't speak. Engines started, tires rolled over gravel, and within minutes, the area was empty again. Sometime after midnight, a passing truck driver noticed headlights still on near the cabin and stopped. What he found forced him to back away without approaching. Shadows on the ground, silence where there should have been noise, and the unmistakable sense that something irreversible had happened. Law enforcement would arrive hours later, unprepared for the scale of the scene. As daylight revealed the extent of the killings, investigators struggled to piece together motive, because nothing appeared stolen, nothing vandalized, nothing staged. It was only when a deputy overheard a neighbor mention a missing hunting dog that the narrative shifted from incomprehensible violence to something far more disturbing. That 13 lives had ended over an assumption never verified. If you're still watching at this stage of the story, it's because the case has crossed from shocking into unsettling territory, where the simplicity of the trigger clashes with the magnitude of the outcome. And what followed, arrests, trials, and the quiet erasure of an entire incident from regional memory, would ensure that for decades, the Appalachian Massacre of 1989 existed more as a rumor than a record. By morning, the scene around Hensley's cabin had hardened into something procedural, the kind of grim order that follows overwhelming violence. State troopers cordoned off the area, counting bodies twice because the number felt implausible even written down. 13 men, all adults, all known locally, none connected to organized crime, none carrying stolen property. Interviews began immediately, but the mountains resisted clarity. Neighbors claimed they heard nothing. Hunters avoided eye contact. A bartender at Miller's Tavern recalled seeing the Lawson trucks earlier that evening, but insisted it meant nothing. The Lawsons were always around. The first break came not from forensic work, but from pattern recognition. An investigator noticed that several shell casings recovered from the ridge matched ammunition purchased weeks earlier at a small sporting goods store, paid for in cash by Roy Lawson. When questioned, Roy didn't deny the purchase. He denied the implication. That response, flat, uncooperative, almost offended, set the tone for what followed. Over the next 48 hours, warrants were executed quietly. Earl Lawson was taken from his home without resistance, hands behind his back, expression unchanged. His brothers followed. None asked why. During interrogations, they spoke in fragments, correcting details but never the premise. To them, the victims were not 13 individuals, but a single offense embodied 13 times. The stolen dog was mentioned repeatedly, always as fact, never as allegation. When investigators asked for proof, Earl replied, "You don't need proof when you know." That sentence would later appear in closing arguments, quoted verbatim. The trial that followed in 1991 was less dramatic than the crime itself. No emotional outbursts, no confessions. Witnesses testified about sightings, movements, overheard remarks. The defense leaned heavily on cultural context, portraying the Lawsons as men operating under a code outsiders couldn't understand. The prosecution focused on deliberation, on the weeks of surveillance, on the positions taken in the dark. When the jury returned guilty verdicts on multiple counts, the courtroom remained silent. Sentences were handed down separately, long enough to ensure none of the brothers would leave prison alive. Yet even as the legal process concluded, something stranger happened. The case faded. National media moved on. Local papers stopped mentioning it. The cabin was torn down. The trail overgrew. For younger residents, the story became rumor, then myth. 13 men died, and the region absorbed it the way it absorbed everything else, by lowering its voice and looking away. What remains unsettling is not just the violence, but how easily it disappeared. How a crime of this scale slipped into obscurity, preserved only in court records and the memories of those who learned. Too late, what certainty without restraint can produce. In the years after the convictions, investigators quietly revisited one unresolved detail that never made headlines. Redbone, the hunting dog whose disappearance had ignited everything, was never found on or near the victim's property. Months after the trial, a farmer several miles south reported a brindlehound wandering onto his land, malnourished but alive, its collar long gone. By the time authorities followed up, the dog had vanished again, leaving behind only a possibility too late to matter legally. That detail, buried in supplemental reports, complicated the narrative but changed nothing about the outcome. The Lawsons never appealed on that basis. From prison interviews conducted years later, Earl Lawson spoke with the same restrained certainty he had shown from the beginning. He didn't express regret. He expressed frustration that outsiders framed the killings as irrational. "You let something slide," he told one interviewer, "and it never stopped sliding." That mindset became central to how criminologists later analyzed the case, not as a spontaneous eruption of violence, but as an example of grievance escalation inside closed social systems, where reputation substitutes for evidence and perceived disrespect outweighs consequence. For the families of the 13 men, closure arrived unevenly. Some moved away, others stayed, avoiding the ridgeline entirely. Birthdays, hunting seasons, and winters carried an added weight, a quiet recalculation of absence. There were no memorials, no roadside markers. County officials discouraged anything that might reopen wounds. Over time, even the trial transcripts became difficult to obtain without formal requests. The Appalachian Massacre of 1989 slipped into a category few cases occupy. Too large to deny, too uncomfortable to remember. Today, the logging trail where the first shots were fired is barely visible, reclaimed by undergrowth. New hunters pass through unaware, their dogs trained and collared, their assumptions intact. What this case ultimately exposes is not just the danger of violence, but the danger of certainty unchecked by doubt. 13 men died not because of what happened, but because of what was believed to have happened. And because no one involved believed questioning that belief was necessary. In regions shaped by isolation and tradition, where conflict resolution happens informally and accountability arrives late, that lesson remains unresolved. The story ends without spectacle, without redemption, and without a clean moral. Only the enduring fact that something trivial, left unexamined, was allowed to harden into catastrophe. What made the case especially difficult for those who studied it later was how little resistance there had been at any stage. No internal dissent among the Lawsons, no outside intervention, no moment where the trajectory visibly bent away from violence. Interviews with former neighbors painted a consistent picture. The Lawsons were feared, but also respected, their authority informal yet absolute. Within their sphere, that dynamic created a vacuum where warnings never surfaced in time. A local deputy admitted years later that he had heard about the missing dog weeks before the killings, but dismissed it as hill talk, something that would burn itself out. That assumption, repeated across multiple institutions, became an unspoken accomplice. During the trial, prosecutors presented a timeline that showed just how avoidable the event had been. Missed chances, neutral encounters that could have reset the situation, conversations that never happened. Yet none of those hypothetical exits mattered once the Lawsons committed to their version of justice. In prison, the brothers were housed separately, a deliberate decision by corrections officials who feared the same cohesion that enabled the killings would persist behind bars. Letters between them were monitored. Visits were restricted. Still, they maintained a shared narrative, one that framed their actions as inevitable rather than chosen. Earl Lawson died first, quietly, without incident, his passing noted in a single paragraph in a regional paper. The others followed years apart, each death further thinning public memory. By the early 2000s, references to the massacre appeared mostly in academic journals, used to illustrate concepts like collective certainty, rural isolation, and grievance amplification. For the families of the victims, That academic distance felt like erasure. Several relatives attempted to organize a private remembrance in 2009, marking 20 years since the killings, but attendance was sparse, and local officials declined to participate. The mountains, it seemed, had already moved on. What remained striking is how normal the conditions were leading up to the event. No extremist ideology, no financial desperation, no intoxicated frenzy. Just a belief system left unchallenged long enough to justify anything. If this story holds attention deep into its runtime, it's because it refuses to offer comfort. There is no single villain beyond the accumulation of small decisions treated as facts. The Appalachian Massacre of 1989 doesn't warn about monsters. It warns about ordinary men who stop questioning themselves, and a community that assumes silence equals stability. By the time the case reached its third decade in obscurity, it had become something else entirely. Not a crime story told aloud, but a reference point used quietly to explain behavior that otherwise made no sense. Former residents described how parents warned children to stay out of certain hollows without ever explaining why. How older hunters avoided specific ridgelines as if they were naturally dangerous rather than historically contaminated. Law enforcement training programs in Appalachia occasionally reference the Lawson case in internal materials, not by name, but by outcome, as an example of how quickly localized grievance can transform into coordinated violence when authority is diffuse and social hierarchies are rigid. What made the massacre uniquely difficult to prevent was not secrecy, but visibility. The Lawsons' movements were noticed, their questions overheard, their presence felt. Yet each signal was interpreted through familiarity instead of alarm. Psychologists later noted that the brothers exhibited what they called closed-loop validation, a pattern where each member reinforced the other's beliefs until doubt became structurally impossible. In such systems, contradiction is perceived not as correction, but as betrayal. That framework explains why no amount of denial from the accused group altered the Lawsons' course, and why the final confrontation required no emotional ignition. It had already burned for weeks internally. The victims, reconstructed through testimony and personal records, appeared tragically ordinary. Men who planned to return home the next morning, men who discussed weather forecasts and work schedules, men who had no awareness that they were being collectively judged rather than individually known. During the trial, one juror later admitted that the most unsettling realization was not the brutality of the killings, but the absence of chaos. How structured the night had been, how little improvisation occurred. That realization lingered long after sentencing, raising questions the court was never designed to answer. How many similar trajectories dissolved before reaching violence, and how many simply haven't yet? In the final analysis, the Appalachian Massacre of 1989 resists simplification. It cannot be reduced to rage, poverty, or ignorance. It exists at the intersection of identity, entitlement, and unchecked certainty, where minor losses acquire symbolic weight and perceived disrespect becomes justification. The dog was never recovered. The truth was never negotiated, and the 13 men never had the opportunity to defend themselves against an accusation that had already hardened into verdict. What endures is a silence shaped by choice. A collective decision, repeated year after year, to remember the outcome without interrogating the process that made it possible. As the years passed, the Appalachian Massacre of 1989 took on a peculiar dual existence, simultaneously known and unspoken, acknowledged in records but avoided in conversation. Retired investigators admitted that the case altered how they evaluated rural disputes, particularly those framed as personal matters, a phrase that had once been used to minimize early warning signs. In internal reviews, the Lawson killings were repeatedly cited as an example of what happens when informal power structures replace external accountability, when reputation and lineage outweigh evidence. Yet these lessons rarely filtered back into the communities most vulnerable to repeating the pattern. Younger generations grew up hearing fragments. 13 men, a cabin, a hunting dog. But never the full sequence. Never the slow tightening that preceded the violence. That absence of narrative created distance, and distance softened consequence. For the surviving families, this erosion felt deliberate. Several relatives described encountering casual disbelief when mentioning the case outside the region, as if the scale itself made it implausible. "People think we're exaggerating," one brother of a victim said years later, "because it sounds too stupid to be real." That disbelief became its own burden. It suggested that only crimes with ideological motives or clear financial incentives deserved sustained attention, while those rooted in pride and assumption were dismissed as anomalies. Yet analysts argue the opposite, that this type of violence is more instructive precisely because it grows from familiar conditions. Nothing about the Lawsons' environment was exceptional. No cult, no radicalization, no breakdown of services. Just a closed belief system reinforced by silence. Even in prison, that system endured. Guards reported that the Lawson brothers rarely spoke about the case, but when they did, it was always in terms of balance restored rather than lives taken. That language persisted until their deaths, untouched by remorse or reconsideration. In the final assessment, what defines the Appalachian Massacre of 1989 is not only the number of men killed, but the absence of any moment where the trajectory felt unstable. From the first suspicion to the last sentence handed down, the path remained straight. That straightness is what unsettles investigators, historians, and viewers alike. It suggests that under the right conditions, catastrophe does not require madness, only certainty left unchallenged long enough to act. Long after the trials ended and the prison doors closed behind the last surviving Lawson brother, the region itself continued to carry subtle traces of what had happened, not as memorials, but as behavioral shifts that outsiders rarely noticed. Hunting seasons grew quieter in certain pockets, with fewer camps set up along the old routes, and long-standing traditions of shared land use gradually dissolved into stricter, unspoken boundaries. People stopped borrowing equipment. Dogs were kept closer, collars checked twice. Disputes that once might have been handled face-to-face were deferred, redirected, or quietly abandoned. Sociologists studying rural violence later described this as a form of communal recalibration, a survival response rather than a moral reckoning. The massacre had not taught the mountains compassion. It had taught them caution. What remained particularly disturbing to researchers was how little the original trigger mattered in retrospective accounts. When asked years later what they remembered most, witnesses rarely mentioned the dog. They remembered the speed with which certainty solidified, the way assumptions hardened into conclusions without resistance. In one archived interview, a former juror reflected that the case felt less like a murder trial and more like an autopsy of a decision-making process that had already finished its work long before the first shot was fired. That observation reframed the narrative entirely. The killings were not the story's climax, but its endpoint, the final mechanical result of a chain that had locked into place early and never loosened. For viewers encountering the case decades later, this realization often arrives gradually, somewhere deep into the run time, when the initial shock has worn off and been replaced by something colder. Recognition. Recognition that nothing about the people involved marked them as exceptional, that their routines, values, and grievances would not have stood out in countless other rural communities. The Appalachian Massacre of 1989 endures precisely because it denies the comfort of distance. It refuses to be explained away as an aberration or a relic of a harsher past. Instead, it lingers as a warning embedded in ordinary circumstances, demonstrating how easily a trivial loss can be elevated into a moral injury when identity, pride, and silence intersect. 13 men died without ever knowing they had been judged, sentenced, and erased from another group's future. And the hills that witnessed it absorbed the violence without protest, offering no commentary, only continuity. Trees growing back, trails fading, and new generations walking ground, and they were never told, had once been decided, irrevocably, in the dark. When historians later attempted to categorize the Appalachian Massacre of 1989, they struggled to place it within any clean framework because it resisted the narratives audiences had been trained to expect. There was no manifesto, no ideological motive, no financial gain, no psychological break that could be isolated and labeled. Instead, the case sat uncomfortably among incidents driven by social certainty, where the perpetrators believed they were restoring balance rather than committing atrocity. This made the massacre difficult to teach, difficult to dramatize, and therefore easy to forget. In documentary archives, it appeared as a footnote rather than a chapter. Its scale acknowledged, but its mechanics left largely unexplored. That absence is what allows the story to feel so unsettling when reconstructed in full. The Lawsons never sought notoriety. They never attempted to justify themselves publicly beyond their internal logic. And the community, whether out of fear, fatigue, or agreement, allowed the event to recede without demanding deeper answers. Even decades later, when journalists revisited the region, interviews ended abruptly once the conversation drifted toward responsibility. People spoke instead about weather, work, and land, reverting to safer topics that required no reckoning. The massacre became something understood but not processed, a shared memory stripped of analysis. For viewers still engaged at this stage of the story, the effect is cumulative. The absence of resolution becomes the point. There is no revelation waiting, no final twist that reframes the killings as inevitable or justified. The truth remains stark and unresolved. 13 men were killed because certainty went unchallenged, because assumptions were treated as facts, and because no one involved believed restraint was necessary. The Appalachian Massacre of 1989 does not ask whether the violence could have been prevented in theory. It demonstrates how easily it could have been prevented in practice, and how rarely that opportunity is recognized in real time. What lingers after the story ends is not shock, but discomfort, a recognition that the conditions that produced this outcome were neither rare nor extreme, and that forgetting the case does not neutralize the pattern. It only ensures that when similar dynamics surface again, they will be misidentified as anomalies, rather than the predictable result of silence, pride, and certainty left alone long enough to act. As the case slipped further into history, its presence became most visible not in public memory, but in policy changes that were never publicly attributed to it. Regional law enforcement quietly revised how missing property disputes were logged, no longer treating them as informal matters when tied to tight-knit groups or families with reputational power. Training materials emphasized early intervention in conflicts framed as respect issues, language directly borrowed from testimony in the Lawson trial. Yet these changes remained institutional, invisible to the public, leaving the broader cultural conditions untouched. In the community surrounding the massacre site, storytelling adapted instead. The incident was no longer described as a killing, but as a boundary, something that shouldn't be talked about, because doing so invited scrutiny, division, or worse, reinterpretation. That reframing had consequences. Without narrative clarity, younger residents inherited only fragments, stripped of sequence and accountability. The dog became a symbol rather than a fact. The victims blurred into a number. The perpetrators became a surname rather than individuals who made specific decisions at specific times. Criminologists reviewing the case years later argued that this abstraction was itself a secondary failure, one that allowed the underlying mechanism, collective certainty reinforced by silence, to persist unexamined. What distinguished the Lawson case from other rural violence was not brutality, but alignment. Every actor involved believed they were behaving rationally within their social framework. That belief insulated them from doubt, from dissent, and ultimately from restraint. When viewers reach this stage of the story, well past the shock, deep into the consequences, the realization often arrives quietly. The massacre did not hinge on one night, one accusation, or one loss. It hinged on a prolonged refusal to interrupt momentum. No one asked for proof, because proof would have required the possibility of being wrong. No one challenged authority because authority was familiar. No one delayed action because delay would have signaled weakness. Each of these decisions, taken alone, appeared minor. Together, they formed a closed system that made violence feel corrective rather than criminal. The Appalachian Massacre of 1989 endures as a case study not in rage, but in inevitability manufactured over time. 13 men died without ever being formally accused, confronted, or given the chance to respond to the belief that sealed their fate. And the most enduring legacy of the case is not fear, but normalization, the quiet acceptance that this is simply how things sometimes unfold when certainty is allowed to harden without resistance. What ultimately sealed the disappearance of the case from public consciousness was not a lack of documentation, but an absence of appetite to engage with what it implied. When reporters attempted follow-ups in the late 1990s, editors routinely passed, arguing that the story offered no new angle, no controversy left unresolved. The verdicts were final. The perpetrators were imprisoned. The victims were buried. In media logic, the story was complete. But in reality, its most uncomfortable questions had never been addressed. How many people noticed the escalation and chose not to intervene? How many signals were dismissed because they came from men who were always like that? How many institutions mistook familiarity for stability? These questions remained implicit, unspoken, precisely because answering them would have required collective accountability. Instead, the region opted for narrative closure without analysis. The Appalachian Massacre of 1989 became an event with an ending but no interpretation. In academic circles, this absence became the focus. Scholars argued that the case demonstrated how violence does not require secrecy to succeed, only predictability. Everyone knew how. The Lawsons handled perceived slights. Everyone knew tensions had been building. Everyone assumed it would resolve itself. That assumption, repeated across neighbors, law enforcement, and social spaces, functioned as permission. By the time the killings occurred, the act itself was no longer surprising. Only the scale was. This distinction matters, because it reframes the massacre not as a rupture, but as a fulfillment of expectations left unchecked. For viewers deep into this account, the effect is cumulative and unsettling. The longer the story unfolds, the clearer it becomes that no single intervention would have needed to be dramatic to alter the outcome. A formal complaint, a mediated conversation, a refusal to validate rumor as fact. Any one of these could have disrupted the momentum. None occurred. The men who died were not selected for who they were, but for where they stood within a belief system that had already categorized them as guilty. They never knew the accusation. They never knew a decision had been made. Their deaths were the final administrative step in a process that had quietly concluded weeks earlier. The Appalachian Massacre of 1989 endures not because it was uniquely violent, but because it reveals how easily violence can become procedural when certainty replaces inquiry. It is a case that resists sensational retelling precisely because its horror lies in its ordinariness, in how calmly it unfolded, how thoroughly it was rationalized, and how quickly it was absorbed into silence once the consequences could no longer be undone. In reconstructing the final phase of the story, investigators emphasized how the aftermath did not resolve tension so much as compress it, sealing the event into a closed historical pocket. Court records show that during sentencing, statements from victims' families were restrained, almost procedural, as if emotional display risked reopening something the community had already decided to bury. The Lawsons, standing separately, offered no apology and no rebuttal, their posture consistent with the belief that the matter had been settled the night of the killings. This posture influenced how the case was archived. Files were complete but sparse, cross-references minimal, supplementary reports rarely requested. Over time, the massacre became a datum rather than a narrative, a number without texture. That flattening mattered. It meant the mechanisms that enabled the violence were never fully interrogated outside specialist circles. Training manuals cited outcomes. They did not teach process. Public memory retained the shock. It lost the warning. As a result, the same social ingredients, informal authority, rumor elevated to truth, silence mistaken for peace, remained intact. When later disputes flared in nearby counties, they were assessed individually, never in relation to the Lawson case, as if history could not recur in the same terrain. This compartmentalization was convenient. It allowed institutions to claim learning without confronting continuity. For the families of the dead, this created a second loss, not only of people, but of meaning. Their relatives' deaths did not catalyze reform or remembrance. They dissolved into administrative closure. In private correspondence preserved by one family, a sister wrote that the hardest part was not the night itself, but the years afterward, when the world behaved as if the scale of the crime demanded forgetting rather than understanding. That sentiment captures the enduring tension at the center of the Appalachian Massacre of 1989. The case does not resolve, it recedes. It leaves behind a terrain altered not by memorials, but by avoidance, where lessons are known yet unspoken, where prevention is discussed only in abstraction. Deep into the runtime of this account, the conclusion clarifies itself without announcement. The most dangerous element was never the dog, the weapons, or the darkness. It was the certainty shared by a small group and tolerated by a larger one, allowed to progress without friction until action felt not just permissible, but necessary. 13 men died at the end of that progression. The process that produced their deaths remains intact wherever certainty is rewarded and inquiry is deferred. In the final accounting, the Appalachian Massacre of 1989 stands as a case that exposes a structural vulnerability rather than an individual failure. Every formal mechanism that could have slowed or redirected the outcome existed, yet none were activated because the situation never crossed an external threshold of alarm. It remained classified as a personal dispute, a rural misunderstanding, a matter that would resolve itself as such matters always had. That categorization persisted even as the Lawsons' behavior shifted from suspicion to preparation. The absence of interruption was not accidental. It was cultural. In communities where continuity is valued over confrontation, stability is often measured by the absence of visible conflict rather than the presence of resolution. The Lawsons exploited that equilibrium without explicitly intending to. Their actions aligned with expectations rather than violating them, right up until the moment violence made denial impossible. When the killings finally forced public acknowledgement, the system responded efficiently. Arrests, trials, sentences. Yet that efficiency masked a deeper failure. The process addressed the outcome while leaving the trajectory intact. This distinction explains why the massacre never generated a broader reckoning. There was no appetite to examine how certainty had been collectively maintained, how silence had functioned as consent, how fear and respect had blurred into the same behavior. Instead, the event was isolated, contained, and archived. Over time, that containment hardened into erasure. For viewers reaching the end of this story, the absence of catharsis is intentional. There is no lesson delivered, cleanly, no corrective arc imposed after the fact. The case does not offer redemption because none occurred. What it offers instead is exposure, a clear view of how ordinary structures, left unexamined, can produce extraordinary harm. 13 men died, not because the system failed dramatically, but because it functioned as designed, prioritizing familiarity, deferring intervention, and mistaking silence for safety. The Appalachian Hills absorbed the event the way they absorb everything else, without comment or memory markers, leaving future generations to walk the same ground, unaware of what had been decided there once. And that, more than the violence itself, is what makes the massacre endure as a warning rather than a relic. In closing the record, what remains most instructive about the Appalachian Massacre of 1989 is how thoroughly it demonstrates the difference between resolution and understanding. The legal system resolved the case efficiently, yet understanding never followed. Because understanding would have required dismantling assumptions that extended far beyond the Lawson family. It would have required acknowledging that authority can exist without titles, that violence can be planned without secrecy, and that communities can normalize escalation by refusing to name it. Interviews conducted decades later with residents who lived within miles of the site reveal a consistent refrain. No one believed the situation would end well, but no one believed it was their place to intervene. That gap between expectation and responsibility defined the final outcome. When asked why they didn't warn the victims, several witnesses answered with variations of the same sentence. They should have known how the Lawsons were. That statement, repeated often enough, became the moral pivot of the entire case. It shifted burden away from those with power and placed it onto those who never understood they were at risk. In that inversion, violence became predictable, almost procedural. The men who died were not targeted for what they did, but for what they represented within a narrative that had already reached its conclusion. No amount of innocence could interrupt a verdict rendered internally weeks earlier. As the years passed, the region adapted without ever processing the event directly. Land changed hands. Roads were renamed. The hunting culture continued, quieter, more insular, shaped by caution rather than reflection. New disputes emerged and faded, assessed individually, never in relation to the massacre that should have redefined how conflict was understood. That failure of linkage ensured the story remained isolated, its warning diluted by time. For viewers who stay until the end of this account, The discomfort comes not from shock, but from recognition. Recognition that nothing in this story required extremism, desperation, or loss of control. It required only certainty reinforced by silence, authority unchecked by inquiry, and a collective willingness to let assumption stand in for truth. The Appalachian Massacre of 1989 does not ask to be remembered for its violence alone. It asks to be remembered for its process, for how easily ordinary conditions left unexamined can converge into irreversible consequence. 13 men died at the end of that convergence. The structure that enabled it remains wherever familiarity replaces accountability, and where questioning certainty is treated as disruption rather than prevention. What endures after the last document is filed and the last witness fades from record is a pattern that repeats quietly wherever disputes are allowed to mature without scrutiny. In reviewing comparable cases across rural regions in the late 20th century, analysts noted a common progression mirrored almost perfectly in 1989. A minor loss interpreted as an intentional slight, a reputation invested in correcting that slight, and a social environment that mistakes familiarity for restraint. The Lawson case did not invent this sequence. It revealed it in its most complete form. That completeness is why the massacre remains so instructive. There were no interruptions, because interruption would have required someone to step outside the local logic and challenge it openly. Doing so carried social cost. It risked being seen as disloyal, naive, or disrespectful. Those risks felt tangible. The future consequences did not. When weighed against each other, silence won. Years later, when educators attempted to use the case to teach conflict de-escalation, students consistently fixated on the wrong element, the trigger, arguing over whether the dog truly existed, whether theft had occurred, whether the accusation was plausible. Instructors had to redirect them to the mechanism instead. How belief hardened into certainty, how certainty justified preparation, and how preparation normalized action. The lesson was not about property or pride. It was about momentum. Once momentum forms inside a closed group, stopping it requires deliberate friction. Absent that friction, outcomes feel inevitable to those inside the system, even as they remain shocking to those outside it. The Appalachian Massacre of 1989 illustrates this gap with unusual clarity. To the Lawsons, the night felt like completion. To the victims, it arrived without context. To the community, it felt both expected and unspeakable. These perspectives never reconciled, which is why the case resists closure even now. It ends without reconciliation, without communal acknowledgement, without an agreed-upon meaning. That lack is not accidental. It is the final product of the same dynamics that shaped the violence itself. As the hills reclaimed the site and time thinned the memory, the structure remained. Quiet, durable, and transferable. Wherever certainty is rewarded, where authority operates without oversight, and where questioning is treated as provocation, the conditions persist. The story concludes, not with a moral delivered from above, but with a record laid flat. This is what happened. This is how it happened. And this is why it can happen again if the process is allowed to proceed unchecked. As distance grew between the event and the present, the Appalachian Massacre of 1989 began to function less as a story people told and more as a silent reference shaping behavior from the background. Its influence was indirect but persistent, embedded in how disputes were avoided rather than resolved, how questions were left unasked rather than clarified. In interviews conducted years later, several residents admitted they learned what not to do without ever being told explicitly. The lesson was absorbed through absence. through the way conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned, through the way hunting groups reorganized themselves along quieter, narrower lines. The massacre didn't create fear so much as it refined it, transforming overt tension into something managed and internalized. This subtle shift is what allowed the case to fade without disappearing entirely. It lived on not as memory, but as constraint. Scholars later argued that this kind of aftermath is more enduring than public reckoning, because it alters behavior without demanding understanding. The region did not process the violence. It adapted around it. That adaptation, however, carried its own cost. By avoiding examination, the community preserved the very structures that had enabled the violence in the first place. Informal authority remained unchallenged. Reputation continued to operate as evidence. Silence retained its role as stabilizer. In this sense, the massacre resolved nothing. It merely demonstrated the upper boundary of what those structures could produce when left intact. For the victims' families, this realization was particularly bitter. Their loss had not prompted reform or reflection, only quiet adjustment. In private correspondence and later interviews, several relatives described feeling as though the deaths had been absorbed into a regional instinct for self-preservation, rather than acknowledged as a rupture-demanding response. That instinct, to protect continuity at all costs, proved stronger than grief, stronger than outrage. As time passed, even the factual details of the case began to blur outside official records, leaving behind a simplified outline. 13 men, 1 night, 1 dispute. What disappeared was the slow, deliberate progression that made the outcome possible. And it is within that progression, rather than the violence itself, that the most uncomfortable questions still reside. As the narrative thins toward its end, what remains is a clearer view of how the massacre fit into a broader pattern of quiet accommodation rather than rupture. In follow-up interviews conducted well into the 2010s, several former residents described how the case subtly reshaped their understanding of responsibility, not legal responsibility, which had been decisively assigned, but social responsibility, the obligation to interrupt trajectories before they harden. Yet even as they articulated this insight, most admitted they would likely behave the same way again under similar circumstances, choosing distance over intervention, discretion over confrontation. This contradiction underscores the core tension the Appalachian Massacre of 1989 exposes. Knowing something is wrong does not automatically translate into acting against it, especially when action carries immediate social risk and inaction promises short-term stability. The Lawsons exploited no loophole. They operated within expectations. Their certainty was mirrored, passively, by a community that assumed matters would resolve internally, as they always had. When they did not, the response focused on containment rather than comprehension. Over time, the case became a reference point used to justify caution without inviting analysis, a warning invoked without explanation. This selective memory allowed people to acknowledge danger while avoiding the discomfort of causation. In that sense, the massacre's most enduring legacy is not fear, but normalization. The acceptance that extreme outcomes can arise from ordinary processes if left uninterrupted. For the viewers who have followed the story this far, the effect is cumulative and deliberate. The absence of a dramatic conclusion is itself the conclusion. There is no moment where everything changes, no insight that redeems what happened. Instead, the account settles into recognition that the structures enabling the violence were neither rare nor dismantled, merely stressed to their breaking point, and then left intact. The 13 men who died never entered the Lawsons' narrative as individuals, and they never entered the community's memory that way either. They became evidence of an outcome, rather than subjects of inquiry. As the story continues to recede into history, what persists is not a lesson widely taught, but a pattern quietly preserved. One that waits not for extraordinary conditions, but for the familiar ones to align again. As the decades stretch on, the Appalachian Massacre of 1989 occupies an uneasy space between history and habit, a reference point that never fully crystallized into lesson. It survives less in formal remembrance than in the way people learn to measure distance from one another, from conflict, from involvement. In conversations recorded years later, residents spoke of the event as something that taught them to mind their own affairs, a phrase repeated so often it became reflexive. Yet that reflex, born from the massacre's aftermath, mirrors the very condition that allowed it to unfold. By prioritizing non-interference, the community preserved harmony on the surface, while leaving underlying mechanisms untouched. This is why the case remains so resistant to closure. It does not end with reform or reconciliation, but with a subtle reinforcement of the status quo. The Lawsons were removed, but the logic they operated within remained legible and intact. Authority continued to flow through familiarity. Disputes continued to be framed as personal until they were not. Silence continued to be mistaken for peace. For the families of the 13 men, this persistence complicated grief. Their loss had not transformed the environment that produced it. It had only cauterized it. Over time, anniversaries passed unmarked, and even the most basic facts of the case required deliberate retrieval rather than shared memory. This erosion was not the result of denial, but of normalization. The massacre became something that had happened, not something that meant something. For viewers approaching the end of this account, that realization often lands quietly but heavily. The story does not resolve because the conditions it reveals are ongoing. It does not shock because shock fades. It unsettles because it implicates ordinary behavior. The Appalachian Massacre of 1989 does not demand to be remembered as an anomaly. It demands attention as a process, one that begins long before violence and concludes long after, shaping behavior in ways that feel prudent but leave the same vulnerabilities in place. 13 men died at the end of that process. The process itself remains wherever certainty is allowed to solidify unchecked, and where the cost of speaking feels higher than the risk of remaining silent. In the end, the Appalachian Massacre of 1989 settles into history not as a warning loudly proclaimed, but as a pattern quietly absorbed, its significance diluted by familiarity rather than time. What distinguishes it from other large-scale killings is not only the absence of spectacle, but the way its logic was shared, tolerated, and ultimately normalized by those who lived closest to it. The Lawsons did not invent a new way of thinking. They followed an old one to its furthest conclusion. Their certainty was mirrored by a community that understood the signals, but chose distance over disruption, assuming that restraint would emerge on its own. It did not. After the trials, after the sentences, after the headlines faded, the region returned to itself with minimal adjustment, preserving routines while quietly narrowing trust. That narrowing became the true legacy of the massacre. Fewer shared spaces, fewer informal exchanges, fewer chances for misunderstanding to be corrected before it hardened. Over time, the story lost its edges. Names disappeared first, then faces, then sequence. What remained was a simplified outline that explained nothing about how easily the outcome had been produced. For those who study the case now, its value lies not in the body count, but in the clarity of its progression. Every step was visible, every assumption was voiced. Every opportunity to intervene existed. None were taken. The violence did not erupt. It concluded. That distinction strips the story of comfort. It leaves no room to dismiss what happened as madness or misfortune. Instead, it forces recognition of how ordinary behaviors, silence, deference, avoidance, can align into something irreversible. The Appalachian hills have long since reclaimed the physical traces of that night. Trees have grown back. Paths have shifted. New people walk the same ground, unaware of what once unfolded there. Yet the structure that enabled the massacre persists wherever certainty is treated as authority, where questioning is seen as provocation, and where stability is defined by the absence of visible conflict rather than the presence of understanding. 13 men died at the end of that structure's unchecked progression. The structure itself remains intact, wherever communities choose quiet continuity over uncomfortable interruption. That is where the story truly ends, not in the past, but in the ongoing conditions that allowed it to happen, unchanged, waiting,